Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to Modulis in this rainy afternoon. So, yes, amazing to see so many people here. So, we are Modulis, and we are not just manufacturers and designers or flooring solutions, but we want to be part and facilitate the discussions of the trends that they are taking shape into the future of design and architecture. And that's why during the year we organized what we call Modulis Talks, when we invite industry experts to share their ideas about those trends. And no better occasion than Kraken World Design Week to continue with those talks and discussions. And today we are very honored to have with us Chris Crawford from Gensler. He's going to share with us some ideas about how acoustics and colors can affect our well-being and how we can use it to our own advantage where we are designing for those environments. So without delay, I'll give you Chris now. So welcome.
Hello. Hi everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm going to be moving around a little bit and hopefully you guys can all see the screen. We'll just start off. Hi. I'm Chris. I was also wondering why I would put that up there when I'm stood right here, but actually it's quite good for those of you on the other side that you can actually kind of see my face and who I am. But I think it's also important to just share a little bit about who I am. I am a father of 3 beautiful children. There they are. And I didn't know it, but my wife actually has just joined me over there in the crowd. Say hi. And I recently discovered that I am autistic. So that's been an interesting journey to think about my experience as neurodivergent. And I've always felt been slightly different, but it's interesting now to get the diagnosis and realize that people perceive spaces differently, and my lived experience will be very different from other people's. I am an interior designer. I work at Gensler. I've been there for 11 years now, and I run one of the workplace interior design studios there. And this is one of my projects that I'm really proud of. And just as a caveat, I am not an expert. And again, I typed in on Google, expert, and randomly this image came up. I don't know why, what he's an expert of, but that's not me. So I'm going to try and give just a high-level overview of neuroaesthetics. But before I do that, I'll talk about Gensler. So Gensler is the firm I work in. We're a global design firm. We have been in business for 55 plus years, offices in over 50 countries, with about 7,000 employees. And in our London office, we're just by St. Catherine Docks. And we're a multidisciplinary organization. So we do graphic design and have designed even a label on a wine bottle all the way through to the Shanghai Tower, which is the second tallest tower in the world. And we have a real interest in responsible design. You can see here just the kind of Venn diagram that we have. And sustainability, and there are other things that can kind of come into this, inclusivity. But I think really the whole point is about putting humans at the center of the experiences that we design. But why am I interested in neuroaesthetics? I think when I was younger, I studied psychology, I studied philosophy and ethics, English language, and performance studies. And I think all of that was about marrying creative opportunities with a sense of science, understanding the human condition and what makes people tick. So I thought neuroaesthetics is really interesting. Neuroaesthetics is a term that was coined by Samir Zeki in 1999. And before I go on to that, does anyone here actually feel that they could competently give an explanation as to what neuroaesthetics is? No? Okay, I feel a lot more comfortable now. Okay. But basically, neuroaesthetics is a field of experimental science that aims to combine neuropsychological research with aesthetics. So it investigates perception, production, and response to art, as well as interactions with objects and scenes and space that evoke an intense feeling, often of pleasure. Or just a more simple explanation, a field within neuroscience that investigates the neural underpinnings of aesthetic experiences. And you can do that in 2 ways. So it can be descriptive or qualitative, so you're actually, asking people to explain their experiences, quite anecdotal and somewhat subjective. And you can also do it in an experimental or quantitative way. And in terms of the actual science of neuroaesthetics, I think a lot of critics around it tend to hone in on more of the descriptive and the qualitative aspects of neuroaesthetics to then, I guess, scrutinize or discredit the credibility of it. Whereas in terms of the more experimental side, it's like following the scientific method. So there's always a hypothesis that predicts results and also invites replication or falsification. And that, I think, it allows people to have a more robust understanding and scrutinization of the findings. And it's essentially understanding how the brain reacts to aesthetic experiences. So it's not just about the feelings that you have, but it's actually finding through these different methods here of like an MRI, ERP, transcranial magnetic stimulation, transcranial direct current stimulation. There's all ways of essentially saying that it's using brain imaging. And it's identifying different parts of the brain that commonly react and respond to aesthetic experiences. So the two areas that take most focus are the prefrontal cortex and the limbic systems. So the prefrontal cortex is probably the most later evolved part of our brain that actually connects a lot of different parts of the brain itself, but also responds to emotions. It also processes the here and now and links it to the different systems within our brain. And the limbic system, slightly older, are much more around emotions, memory, the pleasure principle. And that way, when you see those areas of the brain engaging and responding, that's when you can actually start to get a sense of people responding to beauty. But I think it's important for us to also go back and define beauty and aesthetics and what that means. This is a piece of text by Roger Scruton. I promise after this I'll do no more reading from the slides, but I think it's quite interesting what it talks about. So beauty can be consoling, disturbing, sacred, profane. It can be exhilarating, appealing, inspiring, chilling. It can affect us in an unlimited variety of ways, yet it is never viewed with indifference. And I really like here where it says, if there are people who are indifferent to beauty, then it's surely because they do not perceive it. And yet judgments of beauty concern matters of taste, and maybe taste has no rational foundation. And if so, how do we explain the exalted place of beauty in our lives? And moreover, since it's in the nature of tastes to differ, how can a standard erected by one person's taste be used to cast judgment on another's? How, for example, can we pretend that one type of music is superior or inferior to another when comparative judgments merely reflect the taste of the one who makes them? And the familiar relativism has led to some people to dismiss judgments of beauty as purely subjective. So I guess a lot of people have actually spent time thinking, is there a way of actually putting science into perhaps quantifying the value of art if the brain reacts in a much more extreme way in those areas that we identified? Does that make it more beautiful? Or if the sheer volume and number of people that actually respond in that way, is that another way that you can quantify it? And I don't think that's really the objective. I think what we want to understand a bit more is like what this means for space. So I'll just take you to a little bit of research that we've done in our global workplace survey that was released just last week actually. And it looks at the effectiveness of workplace as well as the experience of workplace. And when you add those together, how that equates to, I guess, quantifying the workplace performance. And I think what's quite interesting is that a big thing that we focus on is that there needs to be a variety of space types and choice to facilitate different needs and different points of the day. And you can see across those, actually what's interesting is a big factor that affects people thinking the effectiveness of the space and trying to quantify that is based around design, look and feel in learning, socializing and working with others. But a great workplace also includes experience drivers. And for the first time since we've been doing this, which is since 2008, we actually looked at introducing some of these experience factors like beauty and like really what does that mean and how does that impact people's perception of space, because beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But I think the point is not to try and identify what something is categorically beautiful, but it's if you think it's beautiful, what impact does that have on you and how you respond to spaces? I'm sure you remember this, right? You're kind of looking at it and the way people perceive things, like what does that actually look? Is it the blue dress or is it the white and gold dress? But there are overarching commonalities despite the subjectivity. And from a number of studies that have gone into how people perceive beauty in space, despite lots of cultural differences, despite lots of different people's lived experiences, some of those commonalities are symmetry. One thing that people tend to really respond well to, and we think that's more to do with us as biological creatures. We are symmetrical, 2 feet, 2 arms, 2 eyes, and that leads us to look more into and appreciate that sense of balance and symmetry in space. What is interesting though is that there's no scientific response to the golden ratio. So actually there's nothing to back and demonstrate that that is something that people universally find beautiful. Another thing, as we all know, is nature and the presence of biophilia in space, greenery. We are, I guess, creatures that are used to being outdoors and in nature, and to create much more human created and artificial environments isn't part of our kind of natural desire. So to bring in biophilia and greenery into the space is obviously something that is really positive. Also the idea of complexity. And typically what we use to illustrate this is even green walls. The fact that you can see something as an overarching large-scale feature, when you go in and you look that it's comprised of much smaller parts, that complexity there and that richness in texture and depth is something that people tend to find more appealing. But I chose this one as well because what is interesting is when that complexity is a bit more regular, people find that it starts to become a little bit more artificial. But then even as, does anyone know what trypophobia is? Yeah, so when you've got something that actually is very irregular, kind of like holes or patterns, it actually starts to make us think of things more like kind of diseases and like skin problems and other things that then we tend to find that less beautiful. Openness as well, just having views to outdoor space, views beyond your immediate surroundings are a big positive, and then daylight as well. And organic lines as well. So again, fighting that idea of very kind of rigid human and controlled spaces. The sort of softness, again, links back to our biology and the presence of nature. And then earthy tones as well. So much more neutral tones, much less divisive. This morning, I was about to put on a bright orange suit, as my wife can testify, and I kind of decided against it because it's some of those brighter, bolder colors which then actually can be divisive. They start to have very different connotations depending on what background you've come from. So earthy neutral tones tend to be better preferred. But then again, as it starts to go into some of the murky colors, sorry to say it, but it starts to then link to kind of mud and dirt and feces that typically people tend to not like as much in interior spaces. So keeping them kind of more neutral and bright is also a positive thing. However, all these things that we've described are visual, and it's like how you respond just looking at something and maybe not necessarily being in it and immersed in it. But one of the things that are really important as we look at different space types that people provide and their kind of experience of like what makes it beautiful is providing variety and choice. And what you can see here is just the high-performing workplaces that we've studied have all of those variety of spaces, or a much higher percentage of those are covered by those spaces. And in low-performing workplace, there's much less variety and choice. But with that, I think we also need to think about the materiality. We need to think about the color, the noise, and all the other senses that go into those so that people can get the opportunity to choose where and when they want to work or where and when they want to be, so those spaces are much more inviting. But in terms of things being visual, one of the things I think is really interesting is the idea of oculocentrism, which is a very long way of saying prioritizing the visual and what you can see with your eyes over any of the other senses. And Juhani Pallasmaa, He is an architect, but has done a lot of kind of architectural writing and academic writing. On the page of his book is a painting by Caravaggio, which is called The Incredulity of St. Thomas. And this is the scene that's being depicted of Jesus after his resurrection, and seeing wasn't believing for St. Thomas. He actually had to physically touch to believe that Jesus was there. So I think it was just the idea of not necessarily prioritizing everything that you see, but thinking about the other senses and how that creates a sense of reality. So in that, and this goes through history, I think from even Greek philosophy, all the way up to modern day, that there is a prioritization of these senses in this way, so and a level of intimacy that comes with that. So sight from like much further away, and then hearing, then smell, touch, and then taste is the most intimate. And with that comes a degree of importance in terms of how you talk about in my mind's eye. You talk about like visualizing things, like how you see things, and talking about the future. Sorry, this is a really poor quality snapshot. But experience and beauty is multi-sensory. And this is an image which is like somewhat inhumane, but it was a study that was done, I think, in the 30s, which was to understand how your proprioceptive experience, which is your ability to move in space, how that affects your other senses. So what they had was a circular box, and you can see this mechanism here, and I hope it's visible, but they had one cat that was tied to this machine that could walk around, or one kitten, and then they had one kitten that was in a box that couldn't walk around but was having the same visual experience. It actually affected that kitten's ability to be able to see and to be able to process depth and other aspects because it wasn't using its body or kind of moving through space. So I think it's important for us to think about how you experience space through movement, how you kind of navigate through, and also designing for the senses. So thinking about how you can integrate sound in space, so that if you have even the virtual image of the fireplace, if that was surrounded by the kind of crackling of the fire, or you could hear kind of movement of wind or trees, is kind of much more immersive, actually helps people feel like that sense of beauty and quality. If you think about the different light levels, how that affects your experience, even using fragrance and how that affects your olfactory senses as you're going through. All of those things are important to consider when you're designing, as well as, I guess, the way that our brain responds to space and things. So there is an idea of phenomenology, which is that any object around you or in existence, to us as humans, only has meaning through the way in which we interact with it and the way that we use it and process it. And so this was a concept or a philosophy by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and that was also developed further by Gaston Bachelard, who was he was a poet, but he was much more interested in space and how we navigate even through our homes. He was speaking much more about kind of a residential experience, but it was the meaning that we get from navigating through spaces that hold memories, that have artifacts, that feel like they're not these sterile spaces. You go through and you get a sense of an expression of personality of the people that lived there. So one of the things that we think are really important as well within space is to think about the accessorization and the things that kind of go over and above just the finishes and the furniture that you interact with, but things that create almost a sense of things being evolved over time. That they're not kind of very artificial spaces. They feel like someone's lived in them. They feel like they're telling a story, and a bit of a depth there. So I guess one of the things that we need to think about when we're designing these spaces is how can we practically measure our brain's response to space, when typically a lot of the studies that have been done so far are in machines like this, where people are just kind of lying still and perhaps responding visually to space. And although I have to admit, within our practice, we haven't tried any of these, but I think when we think about neuroaesthetics, one thing that could be quite exciting to consider is how you can use other things like wearables to understand how people are reacting and how the brains are responding to the space that they're going through. It can actually help us to then think about adaptable environments. And I think one of the things that we do need to be careful about when it comes to wearables is the data that they project out and people's concern around what will happen with that data and what gets done. But I think if we have certain controlled environments, something that could be really interesting is to find some of these more accessible or familiar types of wearables, such as the Apple Watch. I remember when I was thinking about how brain scans occur, and you've got all of the sensors and like kind of around people's heads. There's actually much less intrusive things that can be worn just around the neck, that then actually through radio waves actually signals how the brain is responding. So there are ways that you can get people to kind of use those. And then to introduce that into pilot spaces, we try the idea of getting people to kind of use them, and it relies a lot more on the qualitative information of people's experiences of using those spaces. Whereas this way, we can actually get much more quantitative data and really understand how people responded in space as they navigated through, as they used those spaces. And then also making sure that those environments, as I say, are adaptable, that they are actually responsive, and they can actually give user control over to people so that they're able to adapt those spaces according to their needs and what they think is the most beautiful. That is my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, but we have some time for any questions or thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Fascinating presentation. So we have time now for some
Yeah, we have some
questions.
time for some questions. The Eyes of the Skin.
Are there any books that you recommend?
Not specifically on neuroaesthetics. I have done research online. I participated in panel discussions with some neuroscientists that specialize specifically in neuroaesthetics. I can, maybe we can follow up with Modulus and we can suggest some resources. But yeah, The Eyes of the Skin is something that I think is really important, really great book to read by Juhani Plasma. And then The Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelot.
You know the graph that you showed that was the successful workplaces? That one.
This one.
How was that measured, the success? Was it like productivity or high-performing workplaces? How was that measured?
This one here, what it's actually just showing is in a survey. So this is a global workplace survey. I can't remember the exact number of participants, but it's in the thousands. And the question was literally so in terms of it identifying as a high-performing workplace, there's a series of questions that are asked of the participants in terms of how engaged they are, how much they would recommend their workplace, do they feel empowered in their workplace. And those set of questions create what we call the performance index. And with that, we then correlated their answers to see purely here if their workspace provided those different options. So the people that answered those questions that said that their workplace was high performing, you can see then the sheer number, we're in the 70s upwards, provided a greater variety as opposed to a much smaller number in the low performing workplaces.
Is there anywhere publicly that we can access this data? Because a lot of the time when you design workplaces or say commercial spaces that have workplace back of house areas, they are skimped on in terms of budget and spending money. I feel like if I saw that list and I was a client, actually maybe I should spend a little bit more on the break room or cafeteria or this or that. Is there anywhere that we can sort of access this?
Yeah, it's been published last week, so it's on the Gensler website. If you type in 2024 Global Workplace Survey, it's got it's much more entrenched information. This is just pulling out a very few highlighted bits of information.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Hi, sorry. You mentioned at the start about design for neurodiversity. Obviously, this covered a lot of neuroaesthetics. How do you sort of cater the design for neurodiversity and the different perceptions of that kind of beauty and space and comfortableness?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that kind of highlights it in terms of variety and choice, but that's not just in terms of workplace settings, right? So we think if you were to design a space that was in purely all neutral colors, like it can be very beautiful, but it can also, if everyone starts to do that, all the workplaces become very homogenous. They maybe don't represent the values of the brand that, occupying that space. So we like to create variety and choice in terms of different destinations and settings that have maybe a bit more of a personality. And some, there could be like heavily patterned, like bright, bold areas. There could be some that are much more neutral, kind of softer lighting. I think integrating user control in a lot of spaces, especially like phone rooms, enables people. So we've done examples where a person can go into a phone room. In this specific location, they were called cocoons because the idea was to take the sort of prescribed behavior out of the room itself. But they were able to change the color temperature of the lighting, the dimness and brightness of the lighting. There was a Sonos speaker that they could actually then affect the sounds and play kind of music and then also the temperature of the space. So I think giving people autonomy to be able to affect their environment means that it's going to be purpose-built for them in some way, and then someone else can come in and then use it. I think when we're thinking about neurodiversity, there are certain like very clear spaces that we need to design for, like quiet rooms, library spaces, larger open spaces, smaller enclosed spaces. But I think you also need to think about the navigation routes and how you get to those. So, thinking about just the transition of floor finish. And if you have like a very clear circulation route that's defined with a different floor finish, it makes it much easier for people to navigate in certain neurodivergent conditions. Also thinking about lighting, how that can correspond. I think the ceiling is a very big open kind of area that helps people to take an overview of where they are and help them navigate and have a sense of space. And if you have maybe a really interesting light feature that can create an immersive experience as you're getting to some space, think about an alternative route that can be used that's maybe less immersive and less disorientating for people with certain conditions. That's kind of a very wide answer to your question. No? Okay.
Well, on that note, with that noise, we finish. What a better way to finish. So thank you very much, Chris.